Now, I know you probably don't like poetry, but give me just this one. It's the best poem ever written. So far in this class, we've used inputs as our main way of getting data for our programs to work on. However, more commonly in the Python world, folks use files in order to supply data to a given process. Now, these files take a number of forms. Today, we're going to see a text file, but generally, they contain all sorts of helpful and useful stuff, though today's isn't necessarily useful, it's more enjoyable? I've opened up my File Explorer to show you something. So far in these videos, I've been working in my sandbox.ipynb Jupyter Notebook file. However, next to it, you'll see that I have another file. It's actually a poem, and if I double-click on it to open it, you'll see that it appears in my Jupyter browser. It is the best poem ever written, and I will not take any ats about that. Don't at me. But we're going to use this in a way to learn how to open files and also to explore f-strings, a thing that you've seen in all of my labs, and some of you have been using in yours in order to format strings to print more helpful messages. So up at the top of my cell, I've put a helpful reminder of what the file name is. It lives next to the sandbox, so I can just call it by its name. I don't have to do any special folder tricks here. But what I do have to do in order to open this file is I have to create first what's called a file handle. And this is something that allows me to tell the system that I want to read what's in the contents of this file. And I'm going to use fh as my variable to designate that, but I'm going to use something called the open function to actually do that. And it takes two arguments. The first being the name of the file that I want to open, the naming of cats.txt. And the second is what's called the mode. And in this case, I'm going to use read because all I want to do is read this file. So I'm going to use R in quotes to indicate that I want to read the file. The next thing I need to do is I actually need to read the file. So I'm going to use text equals fh.read, the read method of the file handle. And I'm going to do something I haven't done before. I'm just going to dump the raw contents of the text variable to my Jupyter notebook. And if I shift enter, you notice, well, it's a big old blob, but it didn't look like that when we looked at it over in the File Explorer. You see, it looks somewhat pretty. It's got spaces and it's got new lines, and that's what a file actually kind of should look like if it's helpful to us. But if you notice, in the actual contents of this particular dump of the text variable, we see /n's and we see those spaces, but the /n's are kind of weird. That's where new lines actually should begin. The /n character stands for new line in a string. And so if I were actually to print text, it'll format according to where those lines should begin. But if I just dump the raw contents of the file actually looks like the above. It doesn't look like the pretty version below because the print statement automatically interprets those /n's to be line breaks. Now that's going to come in handy in just a second when we actually break this file into its constituent lines. So read just gets me a gigantic ball of text, as we've seen here. But what if I want to read it in a little bit prettier? Well, files allow us to read them line by line if there are, in fact, /n's or line endings, at the end of all of their lines. So if I want to read lines, is file handle read lines, and then print lines, I should get all of the lines of my file. But I'm surprised. I get an empty list, when I should get each line in its own separate entry. The reason for that is that files do what's called consuming the file. There's an invisible pointer that the file process uses to indicate where it's at in the read process. And because I've already read to the end of the file, if I try to read from it again, the pointer's actually already at the end, and it's not going to read anything else. In fact, it's just going to read empty space. So in order to actually read this in as lines again, I would have to go up to the top, and I would have to read lines. I'm going to get rid of my text blob here, and I'm going to delete the code down here at the bottom. And if I were to print text, I should see now that I have a grouping of lines in a list. Again, because the file, anytime I do a read, if I were to want to print fh.read here, I would get nothing. Because again, that pointer has moved to the end of the file. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that files will always consume what's ever inside of them as strings. Similar to inputs, Python needs to be able to accommodate whatever is in there. It doesn't know whether you're reading numbers or you're reading symbols or you're reading letters, so it's always going to assume that it's a string. If you ever read numbers in, you're going to need to convert them first. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So two things. First, files always consume all the way to the end of the file, so you have to reload the file if you want to read the text over again in a different way, and that text always comes in as a string. So I'm going to try to get that nice effect of having the line number off to the left-hand side of my poem here. This poem is not too long, but it's long enough that let's say that there's a reference to Bomberluna that I want to keep in line 30, that I want to be able to reference that, so I'm going to number my lines off to the side. So I've already created line num, which is a variable that's going to track the line number I'm on. Starts at 1. Unlike programming, we start counting poems at 1. And each time my for loop runs around, I'm going to add 1 to it, so I have line num plus equals 1 here. Now notice I've pulled line.strip into a separate variable, so it's easier to use with my f string. If I pop down to a new line and I print and start with an F and a double quotes to start a string, and then I use my braces in order to do this. Brackets and braces are different. Brackets are for our lists and braces are for our variables in an F string, and I just print line here and shift enter. I notice I get all of my lines, but I don't get my numbers yet, and that's because I am going to include them in my F string here. I could say line num space line, print that, and I get all my numbers off to the left-hand side. Now, usually there's a little bit of space between the numbers and the actual text, and here I'm going to use another non-printing character. So we've seen /n, we know that is a new line. We're going to see /t. So I'm going to put a \t in the middle here, and so my string looks like this, and it's a formatted string. So I have two variables that are separated by a non-printing character that should be a tab here, and if I shift enter, I get a little bit nicer of a space, right? And that tab gives me an even spacing so that all of my lines start at the same sort of left-hand margin. But even more than that, typically poems really only number every 5th line. Here I'm going to introduce you to another operator, one called the modulus. And this operator does a kind of math. It really tests if things are divisible by a certain number. And if so, to do something. It sort of gives you back the remainder. Here we're going to test if a number is divisible by 5, because if it is divisible by 5, I want it to print next to my line. And if not, I don't want the line number to print at all. So I'm going to add another directive here. I'm going to say something like if line num mod 5 double equals 0. And what this says is that line number is in fact divisible by 5 because it will have no remainder whatsoever. So double equals 0. Then I'm going to print the f string of the line number and the line. And in every other case, I'm just going to print an f string that contains, again, I want my tab here because I want my lines to be set in from the left margin at the same level as every other one of them. And then I'm going to print my line here just using another f string. So all I've done here is essentially add one operator that does remainders just to say every 5. So I should see my first line number at 5, 10, 15, 20. And let's see what actually is in line number 30. And if I shift enter here, you see that it's taken away some of those numbers because I've used logic to say if it's not divisible by 5, don't print it. If I look at 30, well, it's not Bomberluna, but it's quite a nice word. Ineffable. Look that one up. And that was a gentle introduction to reading files. Now we're going to deal with just reading files for now, though later in the semester we're going to look at writing and altering files that already exist. But for now, with our new file skills and our new string skills, we're going to see that we can do some pretty complex things combined with everything else we know. So I look forward to doing that with you this week.